fill your thirst beside the river. Wash the journey from your hands. Feel the comfort flow inside you. Come this far, you understand.
Hello, welcome to Healing Outside the Box. I'm Rosemary Lachance, an energy healer and spiritual teacher and therapist. I am your host for this thought-provoking series and am dedicated to providing you with food for thought information and answers to all modalities of alternative healing, spiritual development, animal welfare, environmental concerns, and so much more in the form of guest speakers who are experts in their fields. This series is recorded and will be shown in your area on your local public service cable network. Please contact them for dates and times. Please visit my website and click on My TV Show, where you will find a wealth of information about this show. These shows are now available for you to watch free on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and type in Healing Outside the Box to make your choices. We are constantly adding new shows, so keep checking back. We are also on Facebook under Healing Outside the Box. Please like our page for the latest information about the show. I hope you enjoy the show. And our guest tonight is Dr. James Sesenig. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So nice to have you back. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Sesenig. He has been practicing naturopathic medicine for nearly 40 years and is well known for helping thousands of people regain their health. Dr. Sesenig sees patients with complaints of all kinds and is particularly interested in the treatment of all the digestive diseases, headaches, migraines, joint and muscle complaints, and chronic fatigue. He also sees children with health problems ranging from asthma and eczema to developmental delays and autism. Dr. Sesenig graduated from the National College of Naturopathic Medicine in Portland, Oregon, where he later served as Dean of Education. He was the founding president of the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians, the chairman of its Government Affairs Committee for a decade, and the founding dean of the College of Naturopathic Medicine at the University of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He has consulted for a number of government agencies, insurance companies, colleges, and natural products companies. He is on the faculty of the Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine in Tempe, Arizona, and the University of Bridgeport College of Naturopathic Medicine. The title of our show tonight, which is our 198th show, is called Spiritual Dimension of Natural Healing, Part 1. Okay, so I'm going to start out by asking Dr. Sesenig, what does the title of this show mean?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm not exactly sure where to start, except that it's clear from looking at medical writings from hundreds of years ago, and more recently from centuries ago, that the physicians who came before us understood full well that the physical dimension in which we find ourselves has a higher level of organization, say a vibratory, a non-material, you might say, dimension to it. So if we think of spirit in the real, not so much in the religious sense or spiritual in the religious sense, but spirit in its real sense, a spirit of some essence or something that informs the physical. In other words, the early writers talked about the fact that the physical is not the physical. The physical is an expression of something else. And that something else is that spirit or that force or that, there are all kinds of words from it.
So we're made up of spirit, soul, and body. That's that's what we are, right? In essence. Okay.
And you know, as you're saying that, or as I'm saying that, I'm thinking there are people who are thinking, oh, come on now. Well, here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and this is exactly what the lessons of quantum physics have shown us. When you start chunking down, examining more closely the physical universe, as you get further and further and further into matter, you start taking matter apart, what's left? energy.
Energy, right.
And the lesson of quantum physics, and I'm not a physicist, but the lesson I believe of quantum physics is that it's all energy.
That's right.
And not only that, the energy exists as possibilities, and then it's manifest in certain ways. Now, it's really interesting to me that at the beginning of the 21st century, our so-called science is coming to underscore what I just said, to understand that behind or above or informing all matter is energy or vibration.
Exactly.
But, you know, the ancients knew this thousands of years ago. They had different words for it. They did not explain it in the terms that we're using today, but nonetheless, they knew about it.
So what happened? What happened to us?
Well, you know, I read somewhere recently that, you know, for all the benefits that we might have from science, first of all, now we got to back up a little bit. Science is not science is not science. Science is applied in a certain way. And science is applied within the framework or the paradigm that somebody has. So when we talk about science, we have to talk about science within the material world, or the science in the reductionistic world, because science is not science in that it's in a container, you might say. This is the old question about paradigm, which I think we talked about in other
yes, I think
maybe
so.
in some other shows. But let me come back to the question about what went wrong in just a second.
Okay.
One of the things that's wrong, one might say, is all science is limited by its paradigm. That is the container in which that is found. Now, I could wax philosophical about that a whole lot longer, but just to say it this way, quickly, there was a time when people believed the earth was flat.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And for all practical purposes, it was flat. Because if all you were doing was building a building or riding as far as you could ride a horse in a day, then it was flat. But there came a time when people began to question that, because the information that they were receiving, the experiences they were having, made them question whether or not the earth was flat. I don't know what it is exactly, whether it's getting high enough off the ground to see the curvature of the earth, or whether it's this, you know, the heavenly bodies coming round and round again, or whatever. But there are certain people who start asking, is it really flat? Or if I thought about it as being curved, by which we mean spherical.
Spherical, yeah.
If we really imagine the world as spherical or round, that would explain what we're seeing now. That would explain this or that or whatever. Now, of course, you know what happens with the people who first come up with a different way of seeing things.
You're crazy.
They're crazy.
Yep.
They get excommunicated from the church. They get put in the funny bin or loony
exactly.
bin or
Yep.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They lose their grant money, whatever it happens to be at the time, right?
I know.
But what they're doing is they're changing the model. They're changing the way in this case, the way one looks at the earth. And when you change the way you look at the earth, the science that you have is now actually literally applied in a different way. See, if you think the earth is flat, then the science is going to be applied to answering that question. It's not going to tell you that the earth is round until somebody starts to think, well, maybe it is. So it's a matter of belief. The paradigm in which one finds oneself is a matter of belief. When those beliefs change, then the science changes with it to fit the new paradigm. So there's an interesting book written I think a couple of years ago by the Dalai Lama, for example, where he says in the book, or he talks about his ability because of who he is. He has the weight to find himself having audiences with some of the most important scientists of our day. And one of the things that he points out in the book is he was impressed by the fact that every one of these leading edge scientists that he talked to, without exception, every one of them realizes that the science that they're involved in or with is limited by the paradigm, limited by the worldview, limited by the way you see things. So when you change the paradigm back to the flat earth, round earth, it's not simple. It's not a simple intellectual question here. When you change the paradigm, you actually change. Are you ready for this? You change what's real. What's real?
What's real?
And here's an example. Go back to the flat earth thing again. On the day that you decide that the earth is round, everything changes, because now you can sail all the way to the east, or the west, I should say. You can sail all the way to the west to get to the east.
Yeah, right.
The day before that, you can't do that because you fall off the end of the earth.
Right.
Right? So when people, now obviously it didn't happen all at one time, but when the shift was made that the earth is round, now we can go all the way to the west to get to the east. And again, that wasn't possible before the shift in thinking happened.
That's all it did was a shift in thinking.
It's a shift in thinking or belief.
Yeah.
That's an important thing. It's belief.
Right.
Right? Now we believe the world is round. Now there are things that become possible that weren't possible before. And so you might ask this question: on the day we decided the earth is round and we start sailing to the west to get to the east, did the earth change?
No.
So think about that for a second. We're told, at least in Western history, that for all of human history, certainly for thousands of years, people did not venture outside of Europe because they were afraid they're going to fall off the earth.
Mm-hmm.
When they changed what they believed, not what was real, but what they believed, all of a sudden there's new possibilities. So science is like that. So you ask what went wrong. What went wrong is the 20th century ushered in the reductionistic, mechanistic science. We, at the beginning, or the end, I should say, about the middle of the 19th century, science divorced itself from religion and from subtle influences and subtle forces and so on, the so-called
and spirituality,
and the so-called Cartesian duality. And so for all the things that science may have delivered to us or brought to us, there's a downside. And the downside is it's divorced us from the immaterial world on purpose. Mm-hmm. Scientists will tell you that they don't want to have that affect their work or their outcome, that it's all material. Everything's explained by the laws of physics. Everything's explained on the material world. And not only did that go wrong, but one of the things that I think is really important here is that that way of seeing the world has taken all of the magic or the awe.
You're right.
Or
You're absolutely
the belief in the fact that there's something greater going on here than just the material. Mm-hmm. And we've done that, I think, at our peril. We've dismissed that at our peril.
Exactly. And they've taken that all away from us. They believe if they can't see it, it's not real. And they also say there's a missing link. Remember, science said, I believe the missing link is spirituality, because without that,
that's an interesting point.
Yeah, that's what the missing link is. It's right in front of their noses, but they can't see it.
Well, there again, of course, it depends on what one means by spirituality. But to say that the material world is a manifestation or a reflection of some other world, how could it be otherwise?
How could it be otherwise? But
and here's the thing I find really interesting is that if you look at many of the popular books that are now being written at the end of the 20th century into the beginning of this century, there are scientist after scientist after scientist. I'm using that in a derogatory way because I'm talking about the reductionistic, mechanistic, materialistic science of the 21st or the 20th century. The science that divorces itself from anything else except for the material. There's scientist after scientist who's writing books about, these are people who are computer engineers. These are people who are biologists. They are cell biologists. They are chemists. They are anthropologists. They are physicists. They're writing these books about, as they expand their knowledge, they find that they have an epiphany, which is there's something else going on here that's not explained by the physical. Mm-hmm. And that's an important point. Actually, I go back to this paradigm thing, which is really important for everybody to understand, is that the paradigm confines the way we apply science and the way we think about things. And when we change that again, we change everything else. But if you're living in, believing in, working in a certain paradigm, and you start coming up against information, or experience would be a better idea, or a better word. When you start having experiences that are no longer explained by that paradigm, You know, something happens and you go, wait, that didn't really happen, right? Or wait, that's not supposed to happen. You know, you see some phenomenon or you learn about some phenomenon that doesn't fit in your model of how we explain the world. You have only two choices. You either tell yourself, well, that never happened. I never saw that. It couldn't possibly be. Or the more intelligent person, whether scientist or not, the more intelligent person will say, well, I know that the experience I just had was real. Mm-hmm. And so what I believe must be wrong, right? So you have two choices. When the facts don't fit the model,
right,
you either ignore the facts or you change the model.
You change the model, yeah.
And so it kind of pushes my buttons when I hear people talking about science does this and science says this. No, the science that fits and grows and is shaped by a materialistic view of the world shows this. But a science that is shaped or controlled by or a container for a more inclusive, energetic world shows something completely different. Mm-hmm. And we're at that time in history where our reductionistic science again is coming full circle to know what people before us knew about the non-material world. And not, as far as I'm concerned, not proving that this is the case, but vindicating all of those who came before. It's, you know, it's not, it's really kind of funny to me that in today's world we have science says something is, well, I'll give you an example. We were just talking about this today in my practice. I read an article that appeared in a medical journal just recently about an experiment. Are you ready for this? Are you sitting down? An experiment that was done where a number of people, this is a controlled experiment with volunteers and a control group, where the volunteers were taken off of certain foods. And these are volunteers that had irritable bowel syndrome. They're taken off of certain foods for a 5-week period, maybe it was 6 weeks. And all of their symptoms got better, right? Now this was reported in a journal as new information. And what they said was, what the authors of the article said was that we think there might be a connection between foods and irritable bowel syndrome.
They're just finding that out?
But this needs more study. We need to study this more. Well, there's my point. For those who live in that mechanistic world, where everything has to be shown to be mechanistic, in that model, I guess, this is the cutting edge research, right? They, the authors of the study, are just discovering, or I should say, are discovering that foods might affect your irritable bowel syndrome.
What kind of people are these authors of this study?
Well, see, they're MDs and PhDs.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
And they're just finding that out?
Yes, but see, you just made my point. You're living in a different paradigm. Like, duh, of course your food affects your health. Yeah. Of course that which you put in your body affects your body, right? If you're in that other paradigm, you need, not only do you not believe it, you want to do more and more studies, right? Because you have to prove it, right? How much, so that illustrates my point right there. It's not science, it's the way the science is applied, right? So when people say that science tells us this and science tells us that, you have to say, who's science?
Right.
And then that's a whole other discussion. We want to talk about spirituality, but you get on that one just for a second. Not only who's science, but who's paying for it. That's a whole different discussion.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah.
But my point, I guess, to answer your question, is that those who have been, well, maybe I should say this a different way. It occurs to me that the people who lived on the earth before us, and not just 100 years ago, but even thousands of years ago, paid very close attention to the world around them. Mm-hmm. They weren't distracted by all the technology we have today. They weren't distracted with survival in the sense that we are, like trying to keep up with the Joneses. Mm-hmm. They were paying attention to their environment, and they were able to tease out the rhythms of nature, the laws of nature, so to speak. They observed how things really happen. And what they understood full well is that the physical manifestation of life is a reflection of something else at a higher level of being, the spirit,
Right.
the vibration, right? And I don't think that it's a stretch to say that all healing traditions were well aware of that. And they were well aware of what that level of organization or that level of being plays in our overall health. In fact, a little parenthetical comment here is, if you read some of the early writings in medicine from the 20th century, from the end of the 19th century, they talk about illness begins on the immaterial level. Now, immaterial means, in that jargon, means not material. Right? We have the material level, and then we have the immaterial level, right?
Okay.
Illness begins on the immaterial level, and then it's reflected through the material, the same as life is reflected through the material, right? There's a blueprint, there's a vibratory background, there's an energetic matrix, whatever you want to call it. One of our authors in a book called The Philosophy of Natural Healing talks about people have different names for this. They call it prana, chi, God, nature, oversoul, all kinds of words. Mm-hmm. Different cultures have different ways of understanding that there's something greater than us, that there's a creator, there's a creative force. And that creative force manifests as life and human beings. But that same energy that manifests as life is where the disturbance in this model, this is where the disturbance occurs. It doesn't start on the physical level, it starts on the immaterial level. My parenthetical comment here is that, notice the word, immaterial. What immaterial means today is it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, right.
But that's not what it meant originally. What it meant is a different realm.
Different realm, that's
But
right.
notice how the different realm is immaterial.
You know what goes through my mind when you say all this? They're keeping us in a little box. They're keeping us in a little box.
You could think of the paradigm as a box.
To believe just what they tell us, so we will be dependent on them and won't make any waves and won't look for other ways to do. No thinking outside the box, in other words.
No thinking outside the box. No healing outside the box.
No healing outside the box or anything outside the box. Keep us all locked in. And a lot of people, probably over half this population of the world, believe that.
I think that's true.
But people are starting to wake up now, but not fast enough.
Well, I can agree with you there. People are waking up, but not fast enough. And, you know, the show's about healing, and we want to talk about that spiritual side, but I'm going to comment about what you just said. People are waking up and not fast enough, but healing has to start at that level. It has to start at that level, and as long as you're inside that box, it isn't going to happen, because it's not entirely a physical phenomenon. Now, I'm not dismissing the physical, but we need to incorporate the other side of it. And what people are thinking or saying or doing affects everything else. You know, there's an interesting study that I have just learned about that is called adverse childhood effects. 27-year study that, if I'm not mistaken, involved tens of thousands of people. And it was done by the CDC through a number of different health plans. And guess what they found? They found that adverse childhood events, whether it be abuse or neglect at the physical, emotional, or spiritual level, including all kinds of trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma, and so on. The more adverse childhood events that occurred in someone's life, guess what? The more illness there is later in life.
Yes.
And the illness goes through everything, every measure you can think of, whether it was visits to hospital ERs or emergency rooms, or whether it was terminal cancer, and everything in between. There's a direct linear relationship between the more adverse effects, the more severe or serious the outcome is in somebody's life. So what does that tell you? I mean, is that a physical cause of a symptom that's coming on 20 or 30 years later? Or is that a mental, emotional, spiritual
Exactly.
trauma, is that something that the person is carrying within them about their own worthiness, or I'm interpreting now,
Yeah.
or self-esteem?
That's what I was gonna say.
Have they been affected in some way that it
self-esteem.
reflects itself in their body?
Yes, the low self-esteem has a lot to do with it, and guilt.
Well, they also found, and I think this is the same study where I was told that they found that when someone had an opportunity to tell their story, to just talk about what happened and what they believe about, in other words, without anybody interpreting it to them, but just listening to the story, just being able to talk about it, altered the outcome. Mm-hmm. Right? So the people who were able to tell their story had lower incidences of these otherwise predictable changes. So what does that tell you? I mean, that tells me that there's something else going on there besides the physical.
Exactly.
So
illness is more than just catching something. It's got to do with all of this.
Well, and it comes back to, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was going to say, and whether you heal and stay healed has the same thing. Like you say, if your seam is low and you're feeling good, God, I'm better. Geez, I must have done something right, whatever. And then all of a sudden that starts to come back into that low self-esteem, the guilt, the feelings of all the things, and then boom, you're sick again.
It even goes further than that, I think. In naturopathic medicine or in natural healing, one of the things you don't hear people talking about is this paradigmatic difference. And it's not well articulated, so I'm going to try to articulate it. In the world that we live in the United States at the end of the 20th and now the beginning of the 21st century, we live in a mechanistic, reductionistic world. Everything is physical. Everything is explained that way, or they try to explain it that way. And as I just said, there's another side to the coin, the immaterial. That other extreme from mechanism is called vitalism. And that is a philosophical idea or a paradigm that suggests that the body is not just a machine. It's not a bunch of physical parts. It is physical, and it has parts, but this is part of a greater ecosystem. It's a community of cells, you might say. It's a living, breathing organism where the living, breathing part of it is not ignored. There's something at work in all living systems that's always trying to correct the problem, that's always moving towards balance or perfection or normal, whatever term you want to use. And that something is greater than the sum of the parts. It's not physical, it's something else. Again, there's many, many names for it. In many of the natural healing traditions in the West, anyway, it was called the vital force. In other cultures, it has other names. But that is sort of this, I don't want to use the word mysterious, but I'm going to use mysterious in the sense that it's the mystery of life. There's something about life that's different than things that aren't living, right? And it's always working in the direction of healing, like I said. And so that's on all levels. That's not just on the physical level, that is on the other levels as well. Everything has to be in balance on all levels for health to be achieved. Because that's what health is balance. And if there's any disturbance in that, then one moves off balance, and there are expressions of the manifestation of that, or even adaptation to that.
So what would you say, summing up in layman's terms for our people out there, what would you say are the different, in easy terms, reasons for illnesses beside, catching a germ somewhere? The emotions, right?
Well, I'm going to interrupt you there. You don't catch anything unless you're susceptible to it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
So,
but I mean, people out there don't realize that. They just
right.
think, well, I caught a cold. It's cold out, so I caught a cold. You don't catch a cold from
everybody
being cold out.
Right.
No, you catch a cold from germs that are in the air that someone passed on to you, sneezed onto you, touched onto you somehow. That's how it is. And plus, if your vibration is like their vibration. There's some people that can go out in the midst of sick people and never get sick.
Right. Well, we've all heard these stories about the monk, for example, who drinks a test tube of bacteria and doesn't get sick.
Right.
But I mean, that's a good point right there. In every epidemic, whether you're talking about the flu this winter or you're talking about the flu in 1918 that killed, millions of people, or whether you're talking about Ebola or you're talking about the plague or whatever you're talking about, yes, there are thousands or millions of people who die. But there are also thousands more and millions more who don't, who are exposed to the same
thing, right?
microbe, right? What's the difference? Well, the natural healing arts would suggest that the difference is in the susceptibility of the person, the imbalance.
Imbalance in the person.
That imbalance is not just physical. It's at these levels that you just asked about. I think if you look at every healing tradition, and I'm not talking about conventional medicine, which has little to do with healing anymore, right?
It really does,
But in the healing traditions,
it really doesn't.
we're organized on different levels, and that differs from tradition to tradition. But you have the physical really at the bottom. That's it's like the physical, when we're down here at the physical level is where we're bottom feeders, right? And then as you go up, depending on the system, you have different levels. Certainly there's a mental and emotional and spiritual. Some might even say karmic, right? You go
And
to these
karmic
different,
too, yeah.
you go to these different levels.
Has a lot to do with
right?
it, yes, exactly.
So depending on where the lesion is, where the problem is, where the imbalance is, a good physician knows that he or she has to help get to that level. You have to intervene on the level where the problem is occurring. So if you have a physical problem that's occurring principally because of an imbalance in the immaterial or the spiritual, then that's where the solution is. The solution to a spiritual problem is not at the physical level. You can't heal from the bottom up. You always have to heal from the top down.
Something we talked about the other night, which I want to bring up again, is that we have to believe that we can be healed.
You have to, well, exactly. There's the
We
paradigm.
have to believe. Remember, what did Christ say when they came to him for healing after he healed them? Do you believe that you're
Right.
well? Do you?
Yeah.
Then get up and walk.
Right. Wilt thou be made whole?
Yeah.
Right.
And they did
Right.
that.
Right.
That's the thing. I meet so many people who use their illness for sympathy.
Well, this takes me back to the science thing that we were just talking about. And that is one of the things that science, as it's applied in the conventional world, has done is to make us skeptical about everything. And if you use that example that you just gave, I read somewhere recently that to use that example, when Christ said to somebody, do you want to get well? And the person says yes, it says, pick up your whatever and be gone, right? Or you're well. Or the person asks for healing and Christ lays on the hands or whatever. The author of this book was saying that at that time, about 2,000 years ago, that was entirely possible because the individual believed in that moment.
Yes.
And they didn't have the advantage or the disadvantage of our 20th century science, which has that little voice in there that says, that can't happen, that's not possible, that's not true, science says, right? So it's actually robbed us of the ability to make that shift in our belief by filling us with skepticism where that's not possible.
Okay, I have to bring this up because it came into my head. I remember reading another example in the Bible of Christ. He was walking along with the crowds of people, and all of a sudden he felt somebody tugging on his well, they were the long garments.
Right.
And he turned around and looked, and there was this woman, and she had touched his garment, and he said, what did you do that for? She said, because I believe that all I have to do is touch you, and my daughter will be healed. And he said, woman, your faith has cured your daughter. Go home. She is well. Remember that in the Bible, everybody? And she went home, and the daughter was healed.
Well, there's an example of that very thing.
There again, the belief.
The belief.
Faith, whatever, that yes, it can happen to me. All right?
Well, and that's a really good point. Now, you just reminded me of, I just interviewed on another show that I do for naturopathic doctors. I just interviewed a colleague of mine who before he went to naturopathic medical school, was suffering from a so-called incurable disease, myasthenia gravis. And he was getting worse and worse and worse. And he did some work, I don't know the details. He did some work with someone who challenged his belief about it being incurable. And he tells this story about, he went through some series of counseling, but the focus was on, why do you believe that you can't get better? It's the same thing. And he says that he can remember like it was yesterday, on the day that he finally changed his beliefs, he could feel the difference in his body. He said, I could feel the blood flow. I could feel the pain subside. He said, I could just feel the life come back into my limbs. And of course, that changed his life. That was his epiphany. And that led him to naturopathic medical school. But it's that limiting belief. Now, you know that there are people watching us talk about this who are saying, come on.
Right, I know.
Come on.
I know.
The early writers in naturopathic medicine, I'm talking 100 years ago, 200 years ago, would tell us then that every thought and every emotion has its corresponding effect on the human cells. Thoughts of love, charity, altruism have a beneficial, higher vibration, and they affect the cells in that way. And thoughts of evil or harm or disease or hate or anger affect every cell in the body.
That's right.
Now, again, to some listeners, that might sound really far-fetched. So I'm going to tell you to run out and get a new book called The Biology of Belief. It was written by Bruce Lipton, who's a PhD cell biologist, who was in the old paradigm, who was doing the thing, teaching at a medical school, blah, blah, blah. And his own life was a bit of a mess. And he went off on a sabbatical, which allowed him to sit on the beach for a while. And he tells in his, what do you call it, the introduction to the book, that by just observing what was happening around him, he had this epiphany where he realized that we're not living in a mechanistic world driven only by the physical, where there's competition among everything, but we're living in a world that's a beautiful symphony of life, where everything's interconnected and everything depends on everything else. And it's all perfect the way it is. That was his epiphany, which now, seeing the world differently, shaped the way he was doing his science. And what he went on to show is what people in the healing arts knew 100 years ago or more, is that every thought affects every cell. He's a bit of a renegade, like we were just saying. People go to the funny farm or whatever when they have ideas that are outside the box.
Right.
He's been promulgating the idea. He shows you the research, but here's just one example. He's found that the cells are not, the life of the cell, the activity of the cell is not controlled by the DNA. It's controlled by, guess what? Thoughts, environment, the outside world. The thoughts that an individual has controls the DNA. It's not the other way around, right? Now, he's a bit of a heretic, right? Well-trained scientist. I mean, he comes to this conclusion by looking at this under electromagnetic electron microscopes. You know, this is a guy who's at the advantage of having the most advanced scientific tools available to him. So this isn't his idea. This is what is being shown to be the case. Except that those kinds of cutting-edge ideas or new paradigms are not acceptable to the existing paradigm. But there's, for those who are skeptics about what we're talking about, it's there. The quote, science is there. That everything you think, everything you say, everything you feel affects all of the cells in your body, just like that.
Sensations, thoughts, words, and deeds. That's what it is in a nutshell. That's what affects everything.
You know, there was a guy, let me think of his name, Cleve Baxter. Many people may have heard of Baxter as well. Baxter's story is an interesting one, too. Baxter was a I honestly don't know if he's still alive. But Baxter was a polygraph, that's a lie detector,
Yes.
operator. And he was at the top of his game. He was the top of the top. He was an instructor to the armed forces and police academies and this kind of thing all around the United States. This is back in the 60s now, into the 50s and the 60s. And towards the end of his career, he was living and working in New York, as I understand it, and still teaching and still, operating at sometimes. But he was an amateur botanist, and so he had a bunch of plants in his office. And the story goes that he's sitting in the office one day and he's watering his philodendrons, and he says to himself, "Gosh, I wonder how long it takes the water to get to the leaves." And then, of course, it dawns on him, well, I have the technology right here. One of the parts of a polygraph or lie detector is two metal plates that go on your finger. It's called a GSR, or galvanic skin response, and it picks up moisture, because when you lie, you sweat.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Okay. So he thought, well, I have the equipment right here. So he hooks this up to the plant, and he waters the plant, and he watches for a few moments, I don't know how long, that it takes the water to get to the plant, trying to satisfy his curiosity. He's also a smoker. So one day, while he's playing around with how long does it take the water to get to the leaf, I don't remember if he's lighting a cigarette or a pipe or something, he thinks to himself, wonder what would happen if I burned the plant. The instant that he had the thought, the plant reacted. He didn't burn the plant. He just thought about burning the plant, and the plant reacted.
Did it say how he reacted? Did it say what happened?
Well, it reacted on the monitor.
Oh, on the monitor.
Right.
Okay, yes.
So in other words, the plant was affected.
Exactly.
Later, if you read his, and there have been several books written about his research as well, if you look at later, he comes to interpret the response as shock. If you saw that response in a human being, it would be interpreted as shock.
Yes, the beetle would be going,
but
yes.
he shocked the plant by thinking about. That led him to a lifetime. From that point on, that changed his world.
Oh, it is a life
that
changer.
That rocked his world.
Yes.
And he spent the rest of his life investigating how our thoughts affect not just the plants, but all living things around us. And he got up to the level where he was communicating with other beings, that is, animals and so on, in watching how our thoughts affect what they're doing.
Oh, they read our minds.
It's a fascinating book. I don't think he ever published all of his work together, but there was a book written about his work that was called, or is called, The Secret Life of Cells, or The Secret Life of Your Cells, or something like that. And it details much of his study. But there it is again. So it's coming from, more modern, by which I mean in the last couple of decades, back to 40, 50 years ago. But again,
it's all about everything we learn now is just going back to the beginning. It's not new.
Well, it's
old,
right?
Coming back.
Right. As I was saying before, this is not science now says it's okay.
Yeah.
This is science catching up to where the rest of the world has been.
Exactly.
Or at the very least, science, materialistic, reductionistic science, is now vindicating what others have understood and thought or defined as reality forever. It's kind of laughable, really, when you think about how far behind we are.
Or pathetic.
No, that's
I'm
a better
thinking
word.
more pathetic.
Right.
It's pathetic, and the people are just waking up.
Well, especially, I never thought
they
about that before, the pathetic, but when you think about the state of the health of the world, the state of our health in this country, I have to agree with you, it's pretty pathetic.
The pills and the medicines and the pills and the medicines. If you ever put on daytime television,
I don't watch
every other
daytime
commercial.
television.
No, yeah, right. But every other commercial is
Right.
about medicine.
Right.
And all the side effects and everything else. And you know what? It's all about control. It's all about control. Control their mind, control their thoughts, let them believe me, make them believe, and they'll take these pills and they'll do these things and they'll give them guilt. Doctors, my doctor will get mad at me if I don't take this pill. Your doctor will get mad at you?
I tell people, it's not your job to make your doctor happy.
No,
It's
for
her
God's
job
sake.
to make you happy.
Yeah.
Right.
Unbelievable. That statement is like unbelievable. But
But that shows you, now we're off the subject there, but that shows you just where that system is coming from. It's about fear. The most medical, of course, not true of all, but the system is designed to, what do I want to say, get your compliance by making you afraid of what's going to happen if you don't, right?
Fear is the biggest controller of everything.
Now let's talk about spirituality
Here you go
and
again.
thinking.
Yep.
If you're thinking all your life, you know what, I'm really afraid I'm going to die of cancer because it's happening all around me. Guess what that message is that your cells are getting?
Yep.
Now again, I'm not saying that that is the cause or the only contributing factor.
No, it's not
but
always
it's certainly
only.
part of it.
That's right.
Right? If
That's
you're
right.
living in fear of whatever, you might just end up confronting or creating the whatever.
Fear and guilt, guilt and fear. That's what's used to control people. It's used in religion, it's used in medicine, it's used in science, it's used in everything. And people do it to each other.
You know, you also reminded me, somebody said this today in my office. They said, have you noticed, they said to me about the ads on TV? Said, it used to be that most of the ads on television were about cigarettes and alcohol. But now they're not on there anymore. Now it's about medicines.
Medicine, constantly.
Or-
You don't even, not even daytime. I'm talking on any television. That's what the commercials are all about. Every 1, 2, or 3 commercials is about medicine of some kind.
So if our thoughts affect our physical manifestation of our own lives and those around us, why would anybody watch television?
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, when you think about the message or messages that are being put out,
You know the best way to watch a commercial?
yeah, turn it off.
No, yeah. The minute I have certain shows I like to watch, as soon as the commercial comes on, mute. Mute every single commercial, every single one. I don't even want to hear about it. I just want to see the story or whatever that I'm watching there. That's the best thing anybody could do. Mute, mute, mute. Use that mute button.
Absolutely.
Anyway,
You know, I want to tell you another thing that came to mind. Another colleague that I talked to not long ago, I often will ask people how or what attracted you to naturopathic medicine in the first place. You know, somewhere in your pre-med or your early lifetime, something moved you in this direction or got your attention. And I just was speaking to somebody, I think it was yesterday, where he said that he was actually studying as an English lit major, and his roommate was doing pre-med. And somehow he got introduced to, that is the person I was talking to, got introduced to anatomy and cadaver dissection. And he said when he first was in a dissecting room with a cadaver, he said it was the most beautiful thing he ever saw. He said, first of all, I look at this cadaver, which is no longer animated. There's no life there. And it makes me start to think, this is him talking, what's the difference between being alive and being dead? What's that all about? What is that force?
good question.
So he starts going down that track and realizing that this thing called the life force or the animating force is the sort of symphony of life, you know, that everything is so beautiful when it's working the way it's supposed to, and how everything works together and so on. And it was a little of a stretch for me to understand how he saw the beauty in the dead body that drew him into understanding that there's a force at work that always keeps us on track.
That's right.
And that was his epiphany,
I remember a little, what they call antidote. The doctor said to his colleague, no, he said to someone who said to him, you know, we all have a soul. The doctor said, you're crazy. We don't have any souls. He said, I'm a brain surgeon. He said, I've cut into many brains. I never saw a soul. And the man said to him, but have you ever seen a thought?
Right.
Okay? But it's there, isn't it? Thoughts that people have all the time, but you can't see it.
Well,
So that's a good argument for that.
if we go back to this immaterial versus material, there's a whole lot that we can't see
That's right.
because we're not in that world, or I shouldn't say it that way. As one of my mentors would always say, is we cannot appreciate that world with the physical senses.
No.
So just because we can't sense it with our physical senses doesn't mean that it's not there.
But everyone believes that.
Well, not everyone.
Well, not everyone, but how do we say percentage-wise? What would you say?
Well, if you 85%.
85% believe that, what you just said.
Now, I've just pulled that out of another book that's called Power versus Force by a man named David Hawkins, an MD, PhD, who investigated this. I think he became intrigued by this idea of how many people are actually aware, self-aware, or actually
Self-awareness.
actually can step back and sort of observe themselves. And what's
Yes.
happening in the world, as opposed to just being an automaton. And when he wrote his first book, he had calculated, and I won't go into all that detail, that'll be the rest of the evening, but he calculated that about 85% of the people on the earth were not self-aware.
I believe it.
Now, he wrote a sequel to this book about, I'm going to say, 25 or 30 years later. And by that time, he had said that those numbers had changed to where it was now about 70%.
We're not
So
self-aware.
we're not self-aware.
It's getting better.
So, well, it's actually pretty phenomenal when you think about it that way. Quoting him, or paraphrasing him, he said that that doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to realize that it took all of human history, in the first book now, it took all of human history for 15% of the population to be awake. And in another 30 years or so, that number had almost doubled. So that's a pretty phenomenal change. And I think that I know that you believe, and I certainly believe, that more and more people are becoming self-aware, and that what I want to say, that curve is exponential. I mean, it's growing really quickly.
If you want something more, I find, because I've spoken to people who have had a spiritual awakening, if you want that, if you want something more out of life, if you want to understand, all you have to do is want it. Want it. Just with all your heart and soul, you want it. Something better. And something better will happen to you. And the other thing I wanted to say was, you talk about self-awareness, and the audience out there, has anybody ever said to you, did you just hear what you just said? Did you hear what you just said? What did I just say? That's a lack of self-awareness. They don't. And you're getting the message, listen to yourself, become self-aware.
Well, if what we're talking about is real, and of course I certainly understand that it is, I don't just believe that it is, I understand that it is.
Me too.
And many of these authors I just mentioned certainly understood it and showed it for the skeptics again. Then what you just said is more important than anybody can imagine. What you say, what you think, the words you use are not just affecting your cells, they're affecting everything in the physical universe. So a self-aware person is conscious about the words that he or she uses.
That's right.
They don't just go in the default mode and say whatever they think, because their thoughts are not censored, let's say. If they're living in a conscious world and they want to be a conscious being who is sending conscious thoughts of love and healing, then that takes a little bit of self-awareness, which means you have to censor yourself. You check your impulses and you actually think about what you're going to say. And if that's true, then that's a huge responsibility, right? If you begin to realize that your thoughts affect everything, then you're responsible for those thoughts and those effects. And you can't get away from it now. See, once you change paradigm,
Yeah.
you can't go back.
Right.
So once you know, you can't get away with saying, well, I didn't know.
I didn't, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Negative ignorance and positive ignorance. Yep, you can't.
Well, you also said just a minute ago about thoughts and then words and action.
Sensations, the sensation, first you get the sensation, then you get the thought, then you say the word, and then you do it. And if it's a bad thing,
So those things are all creative.
yeah,
First you think about it,
you feel it and you think
feel
about it.
and then you say it, and then the action puts it into
Into motion.
puts it into
Yeah.
manifestation.
Right.
And look at all the, what are we going to call it, acting out that's going on the planet right now, where all this anger and frustration
it's
and
terrible.
all this stuff is being acted out. But every one of those acts, every one of those thoughts, every one of those statements, every one of those words.
I know it. We're going to continue this. We have to stop right now, but
Okay.
we're going to do a part 2, and we're going
Okay.
to continue where we left off.
Oh, we are? Okay.
Yep. So for
All
right now, we're going to give our contact information. To contact Dr. James Sesenig, his phone number is 203-230-2200, and that's in Hamden, Connecticut. And his office, his office is Natural Health Associates, and the website is www.naturalhealthconnecticutct.com. And for us, I'm Rosemary Lachance. My phone is 203-627-7966. My email is whitebuffalo8@comcast.net. My website is www.rosemarylachance.com. And you can call me, email me, write me about anything that you've seen here or heard. If you'd like more information, anything, please feel free to do this. You're not alone out there, okay? Anyway, thank you for joining us. We're saying good night for now, but we'll be back soon with part 2 of this discussion. Good night.
Good night.